They never really saw her. They smiled when they needed something, praised her when she stayed silent, and disappeared the moment she started speaking. But silence listens, and silence never forgets. The village of Aldridge was small, tight-laced, and painted in polite smiles. The kind of place where people bake secrets into their pies and serve them with warm tea and frozen hearts. In this town, a girl like Elenora James could only ever be invisible or inconvenient. She had grown up behind closed curtains and hushed voices. The shy one, the odd one, the overly sensitive girl who cried at loud sounds and always stared too long at people's eyes as if she could see too much and understand too little. Her father, a school principal known more for his firm handshake than his warmth, once told her, "You'd be easier to love if you weren't so intense." Her mother, she had perfected the art of concern that never touched her tone. "Maybe if you stopped thinking so much, Elenora, people would like you more." And so, she learned to shrink. She sat at the dinner table, listening to conversations where she was never addressed. She passed her teen years wrapped in the shadows of her perfect older sister Rosalind, the beauty queen, the darling of Aldridge High, the girl with the golden curls and golden grades and golden fiancé. Elenora. She was the weird one, the one who read psychology textbooks while others partied, the one who didn't wear makeup because she hated pretending, the one who didn't talk much but noticed everything. The final break came at 20-1. Was Rosalind's engagement party, held under fairy lights and curated laughter in the garden of their family home. Elenora had stood in a soft blue dress she didn't choose, pouring drinks she didn't enjoy, watching as everyone danced around her like she didn't exist. And then she saw it, her father whispering something into the ear of Rosalind's fiancé, the man who had once looked at Elenora before he ever touched her sister. Their eyes met across the lawn, and in that flicker of guilt, she understood. It had never been love. It had always been manipulation, and she had always been disposable. That night, Elenora left. No suitcase, no goodbye, just her journal, her sharp memory, and a list of things that didn't make sense but someday would. 6 years passed. She returned not as Elenora, the odd sister, but as Dr. Elenora James, licensed clinical psychologist, trauma specialist, and grief counselor. She opened her practice in the same town that broke her. People came, of course. Aldridge adored appearances, and therapy was the new elegance. Housewives with secrets, teachers with guilt, businessmen with affairs, they all came, and they all spoke. And she listened, not just as a doctor, but as the girl who remembered, because each of them had a thread back to the family that hurt her, the town that silenced her, and the sister who had always smiled too sweet. Elenora never interrupted. She simply took notes, because one day, she wouldn't need to scream. She would simply tell the truth, and truth, when sharpened long enough, cuts deeper than revenge. She no longer flinched when people lied to her, because now, she could see exactly when they did, and worse, she knew why they did it. The mirror in her office was deliberately placed not facing the client, but to the side, angled just enough for Elenora to catch glimpses, not of their faces but of hers. She had made peace with her reflection, or so she told herself. Gone were the oversized sweaters and hunched shoulders of the girl who once apologized for existing. Now, she dressed in neutrals and clean lines, her hair pulled back with elegant indifference. Her voice no longer trembled when she said, "Tell me about your pain." It was steady, controlled, a lighthouse voice for people lost in storms. But every now and then, when the day's sessions had ended, when the leather chair still held echoes of stories that had unraveled in front of her, she would look into that mirror and see her, the old Elenora, the girl with raw eyes and bitten nails, who had once curled up in the school library just to breathe without judgment. The girl no one chose. Today had been different. Her last client of the day was Mrs. Halbrook, head of the Aldridge Women's Committee, keeper of secrets, an unrepentant gossip queen masked by manicured charm. She had sat on Elenora's couch, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief as she spoke of cracks in her perfect family. Her son wild, distant, angry. Her daughter quiet, withdrawn. "My husband says it's just a phase," she sighed, "but I know better. I feel it. Something's off." Elenora's pen had moved slowly across her pad. Off, she thought. Like the time your daughter ran away at 14 and came back mute. Like the time you blamed it on hormones. But she said none of this. Instead, she looked Mrs. Halbrook in the eye and asked softly, "Has anyone ever spoken to your children about how safe they feel at home?" There was a pause. Then the mask cracked just a hairline, and Elenora saw it. That familiar flicker of denial, the tightening of the mouth, the eyes that avoided the mirror. Mrs. Halbrook forced a laugh. Safe? Of course, dear. You know this town. We take care of our own. Exactly, Elenora thought. That's what I'm counting on. Later that evening, Elenora sat alone at her desk, reviewing notes by lamplight. Her walls were lined with case files, not just of clients but of connections, names, incidents, quiet patterns people hoped no one would ever notice. She was building something, not a case, not a plot, a reckoning, because what they never understood was this: Elenora had spent her life learning how to survive them. Now she knew how to dismantle them, piece by smiling piece. It wasn't a knock on the door. It wasn't a phone call. It was paper folded, sealed, and shaking in her hands. The past didn't return with noise. It returned with quiet cruelty. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and expensive, the kind of stationery people used when they wanted to pretend sincerity. Elenora found it resting at the foot of her office door when she arrived that morning, tucked beneath the brass handle. As if someone had been too cowardly to deliver it in person. There was no name on the front, but the handwriting? She knew it. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from something older, colder. That same sensation she had as a girl when she watched Rosalind get praised for a lie Elenora was punished for. That old aching burn of injustice to quiet to scream. She waited until the clinic was empty. Then she read it. Dearest Nora, I don't know how to start this letter, except to say that I'm sorry. Not for what I did, because truthfully, I don't remember doing anything, but I'm sorry that I made you feel unseen. You disappeared, and we let you. I let you. I think about you more than you know. And I know I don't deserve to ask for your time, but I'm back in Aldridge, and I'd like to see you. Rosalind. She folded the letter slowly, then again, until the creases were harsh and deep. She didn't cry. That version of her Elenora, who wept in silence while her sister was crowned, while their parents smiled for photos and handed Rosalind the world, was gone. But she did feel something, not forgiveness, not warmth, but curiosity. What did Rosalind want now? And more importantly, why now? That evening, she returned to her apartment above the clinic, a small but elegant space she'd made her sanctuary. Clean lines, muted tones, and no trace of the house she had grown up in. But as she sat by the window, looking out into the dark street lit by sleepy orange lamplight, she pulled open a drawer. Inside were dozens of letters, none of them sent. Letters to her mother, her father, her sister. Letters she wrote through the years like small funerals to pieces of herself that had died. She pulled one out. It was dated 2 years ago. Dear Rosalind, it began. I hope you're happy, because you always seemed happiest when I wasn't. She read it with a strange detachment, like reading someone else's pain, and maybe, she thought, that's what healing was, being able to look at your own scars and feel less like you were bleeding and more like you survived. The next day, she wrote back, not because Rosalind deserved it, but because Elenora had questions, and she was tired of letting others write her story. The tea was warm, the smile was warmer, but the silence between them, that was where the fire lived. The calf Rosalind chose was predictably pristine white marble tables, polished brass fixtures, and too much lavender in the air. It was the kind of place where women wore muted smiles like perfume and discussed betrayal in low voices between spoonfuls of lemon tart. Elenora arrived 5 minutes early, as always. Rosalind arrived 10 minutes late, as always. Some things didn't change. She looked exactly as the town remembered her: immaculate hair curled into soft waves, a beige wool coat draped over her shoulders like royalty. Her heels clicked softly on the tile as she approached, as if even her footsteps knew they belonged to someone adored. Elenora, she breathed, placing her bag on the chair across. You look, well? A pause. Then carefully. You look different. Eleonora's lips curled, not quite a smile, more like memory uncoiling in her mouth. I do, she said simply. You don't. They ordered tea. Earl Grey for Rosalind. No sugar. Chamomile for Elenora. No comment. For a moment, neither spoke. It was like watching a performance with no dialogue, only the stiff elegance of gestures and the weight of years pressing against porcelain cups. Finally, Rosalind exhaled. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure you were worth the answer, Elenora said, and took a calm sip. The tea was hot, almost scalding, but not as bitter as she remembered. Rosalind blinked. I deserved that. No, Elenora said quietly, setting the cup down. You deserved worse, but I'm not interested in punishing you. I'm interested in answers. Rosalind's forehead cracked just slightly. Her fingers curled tighter around the handle of her cup. What answers? Elenora leaned in. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Did you know he kissed me first? Rosalind froze. The sound of a teaspoon clinking the edge of a cup somewhere else in the cafe filled the silence like a siren. I was 17, Elenora continued. You were dating him. Engaged, I think. He said it was harmless. A game. But I remember the way you looked at me when you found out. Like I had stolen something. Like I was filth. Rosalind's voice cracked. I thought you were trying to ruin it. That you hated me. No, Elenora said. I loved you. That was the problem. Her voice did not tremble. Her eyes did not water. She had long since cried out everything she owed Rosalind. I spent years thinking I was broken because of the way you all looked at me. Like I was difficult, intense, too much. But I wasn't the one hiding anything. Rosalind looked down. Her mask had slipped, and behind it, Elenora saw not malice but fear. I didn't know, Rosalind whispered. Not really. I didn't want it to be true. Because then I would have had to admit how much I let happen. How much I allowed so long as people kept loving me. And there it was, the confession. Not of guilt but of complicity. They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was real. And real things hurt. Elenora stood. I don't hate you, Rosalind. But I don't forgive you either. Not yet. Rosalind looked up. Will you ever? Elenora paused, hand on the back of her chair. I don't know, she said. But I'll let you know. When I no longer see the girl who watched me burn and said nothing. She left without finishing her tea. That night, back in her apartment, she didn't write in her journal. She simply stood before the mirror in her hallway. For the first time in years, she smiled at her reflection, not because it was flawless, but because it was hers. He didn't come for healing. He came to confess, but not in the way she expected, and not to the person he thought she was. The morning mist in Aldridge clung to the windows like a secret that wouldn't let go. Elenora sat behind her desk, reviewing case notes with methodical precision. The day ahead looked standard: a few back-to-back sessions, lunch she would likely skip, and the usual silence after sunset, until he walked in. He was in his mid-50s, clean-cut, composed, and sharply dressed in a charcoal coat. His eyes were a quiet storm gray and unreadable. The kind of man who had learned to control rooms without raising his voice. Dr. James? He said, his tone courteous but distant. Yes. Elenora answered, standing. You must be Mr. Whitmore. I go by David. They shook hands. His palm was dry, firm but not cold. He sat with purpose, not comfort, and that, more than anything, caught her attention. The session began like any other. He answered intake questions with ease, outlined his reasons for coming: recent insomnia, growing unease, a desire to talk through things. But Elenora felt it immediately. This was not a man who came to be understood. This was a man circling something he couldn't say. Tell me about your family, she said gently. A pause, then, carefully. I had a daughter once. Had. The word struck like a blade dipped in ice. Elenora didn't flinch. What happened to her? She left, he replied, gaze fixed on the shelf behind her. She ran away. Or maybe we pushed her away. I'm still not sure which. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Eleanor's breath slowed. Her pen hovered. She asked quietly, what was her name? David hesitated. Marianne. Marianne Halbrook. A name Elenora remembered. Not from newspapers, not from files, but from whispers. From the haunted look in the eyes of Mrs. Halbrook, who came to her months ago speaking of changes in her daughter, but never once spoke the name. She was 14, David continued. She told us something, and we didn't believe her. Elenora said nothing, but inside, the air changed, thickened. It wasn't about me, he said, but it was about someone close, someone in the family. His voice cracked. For the first time, and instead of protecting her, we sent her away, to a camp, one of those reform places. God, we thought we were helping. His hands trembled. Elenora folded her own gently in her lap. You didn't come here for help, she said finally. No, he whispered. I came because I heard you listen. She tilted her head. Who told you that? David looked up, into her eyes. His voice was almost reverent. your sister, Rosalind. She said you see things people miss, that you remember. Eleonora's heart stilled. He didn't know who she was. Not really. Not in relation to this story. Not in the way that mattered. But now she knew something else. Rosalind had opened a door, and behind it was a girl named Marianne, a thread in a tapestry Elenora didn't yet see, but already felt tightening around her fingers when the session ended. David left with a lighter step. He believed he had him burdened, but Elenora sat frozen, not because of what he confessed, but because of what he didn't. She opened her journal, wrote the name Marianne Halbrook in ink that bled slightly on the page, then underlined it, twice, not for emphasis, for warning, because secrets don't stay buried in towns like Aldridge, not when the therapist remembers everything. Some places don't exist on maps, not because they never were but because someone made sure they were erased. But Elenora had never forgotten the name. It took her 3 days to find it, the camp, tucked into the edge of the old forest west of Aldridge, where the trees grew too thick and the sky dimmed too soon. It no longer appeared on public registries, and the official website redirected to a generic wellness retreat. But Elenora knew what she was looking for. She had memorized every fragment Marianne had scribbled on the patient intake form years ago before vanishing into silence. Cedar Haven, night fences, cold soap, screaming drills. The phrases had haunted her once. Now they guided her. She drove there on a Tuesday, alone, no announcement, no warning, just her trench coat, her notebook, and the sharp edge of purpose. The gates were still there, rusted, chained, and crowned with barbed wire. The sign had been taken down, but the outline of the letters remained on the wood like scar tissue. Cedar Haven. Her breath caught, not from fear, from memory, because she had heard of this place before. Not from clients, not from case studies, but from a child, a girl with a tremble in her hand and burned scars on her wrist, a girl who said, "They told me I was sick, but they were the ones who screamed." Marianne had been here, and Elenora, she had almost been sent here too. The past unraveled fast. A knock on the door of the nearest post office led her to an old employee, a janitor who used to work there. He remembered the girls, too skinny, too scared, never smiled, always looking over their shoulder like someone was coming. He told her about the silence, the code of discipline, the midnight punishments, the girl who escaped once and was found barefoot in the woods, blood on her knees. "We weren't supposed to talk to them," he whispered. "Only the counselors could. But one of them, that girl, she left me a drawing once, said it was her mother, said her mother didn't believe her." Eleonora's hands clenched. It was all true, worse than true, and no one had done anything, because the girls they sent there were already branded as trouble, as liars, as unstable. But they were just unwanted, and Elenora understood that word too well. She stood at the gates one last time, wrote the name Cedar Haven in her journal, beneath Marianne Halbrook's, then drew a line connecting them. Someone had paid to send her there, someone had buried the evidence, and now that someone would remember what it means to be forgotten. Because Elenora wasn't done listening, she was starting to speak. It began with a box in the attic. Elenora hadn't meant to find it. She was searching for an old yearbook from her university days when the floorboard creaked open above the guest room closet. The wooden box inside was plain, aged, and wrapped in a faded red ribbon that had turned nearly gray with dust. There was no label, but the smell, that damp scent of pressed paper and long dead perfume, told her what it was. Memory, sealed. She opened it slowly. Inside were letters, dozens, all addressed to Elenora James, her grandmother. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and oddly familiar, because it matched Eleonora's. The letters were not love notes. They were warnings, messages from someone named Clara, always signed with the phrase, "For those who were never allowed to stay." One letter stopped her cold. "They took her name off the tree, Izzy. Just cut it off like a rotten limb," said she. "Brought disgrace. But I know the truth. She was the only one of us who ever told it. You have to protect the next one. The girl who sees too much. The one they'll call difficult." Elenora read the paragraph 3 times. She already knew. This was not about Marianne. This was about her. Someone had seen what she would become. Someone had warned her grandmother. And someone in the family had already been erased before her. A cousin. A great aunt? A sister? She flipped through the letters until she found the name again. Clara Elenora James. The same middle name. She whispered it aloud. Felt something shift. The next morning, she called the county archives. "I'm looking for A birth certificate, she said, possibly sealed. For a Clara Elenora James, born sometime around 1947. The line went silent. Then, you're not the first to ask. Some families keep their skeletons in the closet. Hers built a throne from them and expected every daughter to kneel before it. The county clerk's office was quieter than usual, filled only with the ticking of a broken wall clock and the hum of a radiator that never seemed to stop. Elenora sat at the counter, her fingers loosely clasped, trying not to reveal the tremor in her right thumb. Across from her, a woman in her 60s, thin-rimmed glasses, librarian eyes held a yellowing folder. You know, the clerk said, placing it gently on the counter. This file was marked for destruction 10 years ago. Someone blocked it, left a handwritten note. She leaned in, said, "Do not remove until the girl is ready." Eleanor's throat tightened. What girl? It didn't say, but I'd wager a guess you already know. Inside the file were 3 documents: a birth certificate, a commitment notice to a medical asylum, and a photograph, black and white, blurred at the edges like memory. The name was there in neat ink: Clara Elenora James, born 1947, died 1965. Official cause: complications from mental illness. But the notes in the margins told another story. Subject reported assault by family member, deemed hysterical. Mother refused to acknowledge claims. Father requested institutionalization. No further visitors recorded after initial intake. Elenora held the page like it might burn her, because it already had. This wasn't just history. It was prophecy. She turned to the photograph. The girl in the image was barely 17, long hair pulled back, eyes that held both fear and fury, eyes that looked like Eleanor's. When she got home that night, the wind howled around the corners of her old Victorian house like a warning. She climbed into the attic, sat among the open letters, the empty tea tins, the ghosts, and she whispered, "Clara, I'm listening." Something in the air shifted. Not a sound, but a knowing, a click inside her bones. Because this was not about one girl. This was generational. Women who had seen too much, girls who had spoken too loudly, daughters who had been sacrificed to protect the image of the James family. And suddenly, everything made sense. Why Rosalind had always been the star. Why Elenora had always been the problem. Why her mother looked through her, not at her. She wasn't difficult. She was dangerous. Dangerous to those who built their power on silence. The next morning, she visited her mother. It had been months since their last conversation. Her mother lived in a pristine white house with lilies by the door and no photos on the mantle that included Elenora past the age of 12. "You've been digging," her mother said, not unkindly, just flatly. "You knew about Clara." "Of course I did. She was my aunt. And you let her be erased." Her mother didn't flinch. "She was a tragedy. She was a warning," Elenora said. Silence. Then, "You think you're different from her?" "No," Elenora whispered. "I think I'm the first one who survived." That night, she returned home and pulled out every client file she'd ever archived. She wrote one name in bold across the first folder, Marianne Halbrook, then another, Clara Elenora James, then a third, Elenora James, and beneath them, she wrote, "I remember. And I will not be the last." Because it wasn't just about healing now. It was about reckoning. And the reckoning had a name. Not all battles are fought with fists. Some are fought with truth, and some with silence so deafening it cracks the bones. Of legacy, Elenora stood in front of her bookshelf, not to select a book, but to pull it forward. A small green volume titled The Roots of Family Systems. Behind it, a hidden compartment clicked open. Inside, a set of cassette tapes. Unlabeled, they belonged to her grandmother. She hadn't dared play them before. Not until now. She slipped one into the player, pressed the worn brass button, and waited. Static. Then a voice. "Isabel, if you're hearing this, it means they got to her too." "Clara." The voice was clear, clipped, but carried a tremor that haunted. "They took everything. My voice, my name, my chance. But you still have yours. And if this curse ever returns to another girl in our bloodline, you know what to do." The tape ended with a click. No goodbye. That night, Elenora didn't sleep. Instead, she built a wall of faces. Printouts of every girl and woman who had come to her practice in the last 10 years. She marked the ones who had been dismissed, the ones called hysterical, the ones who had warned her in quiet tears, their stories laughed off by fathers, boyfriends, priests. She saw it clearly now. The cycle wasn't just personal. It was systemic. and she was ready to break it. Her first step was subtle. A note sent to a journalist she trusted from her university days. Come alone. Bring nothing but a pen. They met in the garden behind her clinic, where lavender grew wild and unwatched. You sure you want to do this? The journalist asked. They buried a girl named Clara. They institutionalized her to protect a predator. That predator still sits on the Aldridge Foundation board. The journalist raised an eyebrow. Name? Harold James. My grandfather. The pen hovered. This will explode. That's the point. The article ran 5 days later. Front page. Full spread. Names named. Clara's file was published in full. The town's polished mask cracked. Elenora received 3 anonymous letters. One with flowers. One with ashes. One with a single line written in jagged ink. You should have stayed silent. She framed that one, because silence was the weapon they used, and she was disarming it. More women came forward. Not just former clients. Not just Aldridge locals. Women. From across the country. Survivors of camps like Cedar Haven. Daughters disowned. Sisters forgotten. They called themselves the Whispered, and Elenora became their anchor. But not everyone celebrated. Her sister Rosalind called her. You're ruining everything we built. Eleanor's voice was calm. Everything you built was on our backs. You're turning this into a war. No, Elenora replied. I'm just finally fighting back. She sat down that night and wrote a letter to Clara. Not to send, just to speak. You were right. They did take your voice, but I'm using mine now, and for every girl they tried to erase, I will remember. Every name, every story, every scream behind the closed doors. She folded the letter and placed it inside her journal. The journal that would become a book. The book that would become a beacon, because reckoning had begun, and Elenora James had only just started. The world remembers what is repeated, and Elenora was done repeating silence. It was time the story changed. It began with the book, not the one she planned to write, but the one she started reading aloud, every Sunday morning, in the garden behind her clinic. She began reading the letters Clara had written, one by one. She didn't advertise it. She didn't need to. People came. First, a few, then dozens. Then women who drove 5 hours just to sit on the grass and hear truth spoken like gospel. She called it the circle of names, and every week, a new name was added. A girl lost. A woman erased. A daughter silenced. Now remembered. Elenora transformed the top floor of her clinic into an archive, not just of her family, but of every survivor who came forward. Testimonies, drawings, recordings, pieces of pain that became mosaics of power. The press called it a grassroots reckoning, the foundation called it dangerous, but Elenora called it necessary, and she had more to say. Her second step was global, a collaboration with international advocates, survivors from Ireland, Poland, Germany, girls who'd lived through similar institutions, bearing different names but identical bruises. They launched a virtual museum. Daughters of the Forgotten. It went viral. Donations poured in, and soon, Cedar Haven wasn't just exposed, it was condemned, dismantled, and converted into a sanctuary for trauma recovery. Marianne Halbrook was the first to walk through its doors. Her tears baptized the entrance. Elenora gave a TED Talk. She didn't speak of revenge, she spoke of reclamation. They told us we were crazy. We weren't. We were inconvenient. They called us liars. We weren't. We were survivors. And now, we are historians of our own pain. We remember, so we can never be erased again. The crowd stood before she finished. Rosalind never apologized, but one day, she came to the garden. She stood at the edge of the circle, her hands trembling, a bouquet of white peonies in her grip. Elenora walked to her. Do you want to speak? She asked. Rosalind shook her head. Tears welled. Then sit, Elenora whispered. And listen. That was enough. Years later, the journal was published. The therapist who remembered. It became a movement, a curriculum, a standard in trauma studies. But more than anything, it became a lighthouse for those lost in the fog of generational silence. And on the last page, beneath the acknowledgments, a single line remained, for Clara who spoke first, and for every girl who speaks next. The legacy she inherited tried to break her, but the legacy she built, it would outlive them all. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. But when one woman dares to remember what others erased, healing begins. Let Elenora's story remind us, silence can be inherited, but so can courage. And when we speak, not just for ourselves but for those forgotten, we rewrite history. not with vengeance, but with truth, for Clara, for Marianne, for all the daughters, never named. Speak, remember, rise.